Father Patrick Morrow, St Michael and All Angels with St Mary, Little Ilford, Diocese of Chelmsford. The Feast of Palm Sunday, with the Passion narrative according to Matthew. The blessings of the feast be with you. This is going to be the first of two reflections. Now, the great 20th century theologian Karl Barth said that what the preacher does when he rises into the pulpit, and it tended to be men and intended to be in pulpits in his day, was that he went in with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other hand, and the sermon was to be a dialogue between the two. You can tell he was a 20th century gentleman because he still thought that people got their news through a newspaper which they held in their hands. That's perfectly valid. But it's not unchallengeable, and the other school of thought that says this, especially when it comes to the major festivals, we do come with our own crises and concerns, but we come to let them be enlarged by entering into a wider story, the story of our Lord Jesus Christ among his own people, the story of salvation, the story of the universe. And so what we do when we come to church is we fully inhabit that bigger story by attending to the readings and the prayers that are set for that particular festival within the wider story. So today, the story of the palms and the entrance into Jerusalem, and the story of the Passion this year in Matthew. Both of these things are right, and what I intended to do, and what I will do in the second reflection, is reflect on aspects of that narrative not really relating to coronavirus and the national crisis. But there is something which struck me really powerfully this morning when we read through the Passion of Matthew in dialogue form, in virtuality by the use of Zoom. It hasn't struck me before, so I wanted to reflect on it. The Passover meal that Jesus enjoyed would have been a long and involved meal. Now, in later Jewish tradition, it's an extremely long and involved meal. It is called a seder, it is called an ordering, because there is a whole set of things you have to get through with ritual act, with prayer, with text, with discussion, with debate, with disagreement, with to and fro, before you even get to the main course. You might sit down to eat at 8, you might not get to the main course till 11. That's later Judaism, that's living Judaism. And of course that's a problem for Jews this year, where they can't gather as an extended family, just as it's painful for us who can't gather as a Christian family. Although we know that Jesus didn't have a full Passover Seder like that, because some of the things you do along the way refer to historical actions which are later than Jesus, although it wouldn't have been quite a Passover Seder, we do know, don't we, from the Gospels as a whole, that Jesus did a lot of his teaching, his listening, his learning, his conversing, his debating, his disagreeing, his challenging, and his affirming in the course of meals. Isn't there, I put it to you, isn't there enough in the Gospels to suggest that the main place for debate was alongside companionship meaning those you share your bread with, was in the context of meals? If you don't find it in the Gospels, I ask you to trust me that it is there in other historical sources, such as we have them. So, it is likely, it is a moral certainty, that the Passover meal will have been long and involved and involved all kinds of discussions which are not recorded in the Gospels. And that is striking, because when you go through the whole story, what is striking is how in Matthew and indeed in the other Gospels, different in John, but certainly Matthew, Mark and Luke, the meal is really quite a short affair that you get through in quite a low number of verses, and then suddenly you're into a time away from conviviality, away from feasting. First of all, you're in the Mount of Olives, on the Mount of Olives with all the disciples, and then further away still in Gethsemane, where Jesus is alone. He's alone away from the people feasting in Jerusalem, and he's alone with just a few disciples, and he's even further alone, because however it happens, it's hard to know. But these few disciples couldn't be bothered to stay awake when Jesus was facing all that he was facing. And so he's triply alone, in utter isolation, in Gethsemane, on this evening, which should be the evening of conviviality like no other in the calendar which he himself inhabited. And I felt that with force precisely this year. That means that we are sharing in the isolation of Jesus Christ in the night of that first Last Supper, that night that should have been the great fellowship meal. It ends in utter isolation, with Jesus, either literally or as it were, sweating blood, alone, where even his nearest and dearest were unavailable for him, were not able to attend to him. But we can, of course, reverse that very point and say that when we feel utter isolation, as we do in the middle of this national crisis, we can know, because the Bible tells us so, that Jesus is with us in that. And so this Palm Sunday is not wholly different from what went on when the mysteries were first brought into the world through all that we face in Holy Week and Easter.